Hello, you've reached episode 9 of the podcast series, The Question of God. Has our civilization outgrown God? My name is Sophie Minerva. I'm a professor of philosophy at NLA University College in Oslo. This podcast series is the result of a pedagogical experiment I conducted last year, and 12 episodes have been made. The recording you are listening to is from cafe conversations I had with 4 students about questions related to God. The students represented different positions on the God question. 2 were atheists, 1 was an agnostic, and 1 was a Christian theist. Our starting point was the book Outgrowing God by the well-known atheist Richard Dawkins. The topic for the discussion this 9th time was the concept of evolution. What is it, and what is the evidence for it? Let's join the conversation in the cafe. All right, everyone, the recorder's on. Astrid will not be joining us today. She sends her apologies. So, shall we start? Thomas, you prepared an introduction. We're going to look at chapters 7 to 10 of Dawkins' book and talk about evolution. Thomas, please go ahead.
Yes, let's see. So, Dawkins says he used to believe the world was created until he was about 15 years old. He writes, quote, "Everything about an animal or a plant, every detail, looked as if someone had designed and created it," unquote. But as he grew older, he changed his mind. He says, quote, "I finally gave up the idea of gods when I learned about evolution and the true explanation of why living things look designed," unquote. The following chapters in his book deal with arguments that evolution is a better explanation than creation. One of his arguments is that the apparent design we see in living things is not perfect. There seem to be flaws and weaknesses that would hardly be there if a divine and perfect creator was responsible for it, right? How could an almighty creator design something that is not optimal? It doesn't make any sense. Isn't it a better explanation that certain biological structures are spread by natural selection because they have survival value even though they aren't perfect? Okay, what about examples of flawed design? One example Dawkins uses is the eyes of vertebrates, which he says are wired up back to front. Unlike the eyes of the octopus, the light-sensitive cells in the retina of vertebrates are located behind the nerve cells in the eye. This means light will be scattered as it passes through the nerve cells, making vision blurry. It seems suboptimal, right? I'm starting to sound like an engineer. Anyway, a perfect creator would never have done it that way, right? Isn't it obvious?
Well, yes and no. I know the argument. It's often called the argument from bad design. It's an interesting argument, but it's not particularly strong as an argument against a creator.
Oh yeah, Douglas? Why not?
First of all, it is logically possible for a creator to have made a world where life would evolve through blind processes. Secondly, if you're going to criticize the design, you need to know what factors went into the design. Engineering is all about so-called constrained optimality. Take your laptop as an example. Would the perfect laptop have twice the screen size? Then you wouldn't be able to fit it in your bag. So those who believe in a creator might suggest there are good reasons for designing vertebrate eyes as we see them today. And by the way, I think there is a huge paradox in using the vertebrate's eyes as an example of non-design or bad design. Most people who study the structure and the function of eyes are struck by its brilliant design, not the opposite.
Huh, really, Douglas? This is how you answer your fellow atheist? You don't sound much like an atheist, do you?
I just don't like bad arguments.
Did you notice that Dawkins said he stopped believing in gods? But gods are just one of many possible explanations of intelligent design. So you cannot reject intelligent design by rejecting gods or the creator God. Besides, the main question is whether the universe and life on Earth are the product of blind forces or intelligent design. And given that Dawkins admits that life forms really look designed, I was wondering about who has burden of proof here.
This is actually an interesting point, Hiromi. You are talking about appearances of and facts about reality.
Yes, appearances and facts. That's right, Douglas. And I found a reference here. The philosopher Richard Swinburne argues for something he calls the principle of credulity. He says it is rational to believe that things are as they appear to us to be unless we have evidence to think that they are not. Or if you cannot trust the way things seem to you without requiring confirming independent evidence, you can't trust anything at all, right? Because all your evidence would then require further evidence. In other words, since Dawkins admits life appears to be designed, he needs to show why it really isn't. But I don't see him do that. He doesn't present sufficient evidence to show that the appearance of design is misleading. Basically, he just asserts that it is. What do you guys think?
Yeah, I think he just asserts it.
I'm not sure I understand what you mean, Hiromi. What's the relevance?
Darwin himself simply assumed that there were no limits to what natural variation and natural selection can explain about life once it had appeared, right? And Dawkins makes the same assumption. But doesn't this assumption ignore the proper burden of proof and stand Swinburne's principle of credulity on its head?
Sorry, I still don't get it.
I mean, Dawkins says that purely natural processes can explain away the appearance of design. But rather than proving that these natural processes really can explain away the appearance of design, he just assumes that they can. And then he challenges the world to prove him wrong. Isn't that so?
Hiromi makes some good points. Flawed design is not a good argument against design, is it? A particulate filter on a car that fails to meet some abstract idea of perfection doesn't mean the car is not designed.
But wait a minute. Isn't it a contradiction in terms to talk about a perfect engineer creating a particulate filter that isn't perfect?
Not necessarily. Remember my example about the perfect laptop.
I have another example, an organic one. Can you say that a garden is not designed because there are weeds in the flower beds? The rest of the garden will still be evidence of a gardener, right? Even if the weeds are there. Maybe the gardener just likes weeds or didn't do a good job or simply isn't finished with the garden yet.
All right, I see your point, Hiromi. But things would be easier if the gardener came and introduced himself, wouldn't it?
You're right, Thomas, it would. Then we could ask him about the weeds. By the way, I've also been looking into Dawkins' argument about our eyes being wired backwards. I found a quote from biologist Michael J. Denton. He says that, quote, "The very high energy requirements of the photoreceptor cells in the vertebrate retina suggests that the design of the vertebrate retina may actually represent a unique solution to the problem of supplying the photoreceptor cells of higher vertebrates with abundant oxygen and nutrients," unquote. Biologist George Ayoub says that attempts to eliminate the blind spot in the vertebrate eye lead to, quote, "a host of new and more serious functional problems," unquote.
You have really studied this, haven't you, Hiromi? You sound like a biologist.
It interests me, Thomas, and I have more. In 2007, a team of physicists and biologists discovered that some cells act like optical fibers, sending light directly from the surface of the structure to the rods and cones of the retina. These fiber optic glial cells channel specific wavelengths of light in such a way that they, quote, "actually improve daytime vision without compromising the quality of night vision," unquote. I also found an article on the science website phys.org which states, quote, "The fact that the photoreceptors sit at the back of the retina is not a design constraint, it's a design feature. The idea that the vertebrate eye could have been somehow improved if it had only been able to orient its wires behind the photoreceptor layer is completely misguided," unquote.
So, Dawkins' argument is scientifically outdated? That's what you're saying?
Yeah, Thomas, that's what she's saying. And she is right.
Okay, let's take a short break here. When we come back, I want to talk about how the idea of evolution as a concept has influenced our understanding of reality over the last 150 years. Okay? More coffee. Here we go again. We have had a short break and will continue. So, today we are talking about evolution, and we've heard some good reflections from all three of you. Before we go further, I'd like to say something about how the word evolution has a number of different meanings. Evolution can simply mean development or change over time from natural processes like erosion to the intelligent development of a design by engineers. Evolution in this sense is uncontroversial. Also, when we talk about evolution in biology, it can happen in different ways and at different levels. Breeding animals for certain traits is, of course, an intelligently guided form of evolution. If a species changes some of its traits or becomes a new species through a process of chance variation and natural selection, this is an example of unguided evolution. A distinction is often made between small-scale microevolution on one hand and large-scale macroevolution on the other hand. Microevolution occurs, for example, when random mutations and natural selection result in bacteria becoming resistant to a particular drug, or when finches develop a different beak size due to changing environmental conditions. Everyone accepts microevolution. However, according to macroevolution, unguided processes also result in new types of cells or new animal phyla or body plans, and so on. There is definitely some debate as to whether unguided macroevolution is true. You see the difference? Finally, evolution can also be a label for a certain worldview that says the entire universe and life are constantly evolving forward and upward, making improvements in all areas. In this great and overarching evolutionary story or narrative, one imagine that living organisms become more evolved, civilizations become more civilized, human beings become more noble, cultures become more sophisticated, and so on in an unending process. This view flourished in Darwin's time, inspired by trends in philosophy as well as by technological and scientific advances. Modernism is a term we associate with this period, but this modernistic optimism was severely shaken after two terrible world wars, also followed by several bloody revolutions. All this was ushering in the era of what is called postmodernism. So, you see how a scientific theory can be entwined with a philosophical worldview and influence a culture on many levels. Yes, Thomas, you have a question.
Yes, Professor. I have wondered, what's the difference between Darwinism and neo-Darwinism?
Darwinism is characterized by the philosophical view that all existing species were produced through a blind process of descent with modification driven forward by the combination of natural variation and natural selection. Darwin envisioned evolution as a tree of life in which everything evolved by natural processes from a single primordial organism. Originally, he was open to the possibility that the primordial organism might have been created by God, but his theory of evolution by natural selection was soon combined with a naturalistic worldview. Then it became necessary that everything is the result of unguided physical forces. So, what about neo-Darwinism? Well, it is a kind of modernization of Darwinism. It rounds out the Darwin's theory of evolution with knowledge about genetic information and genetic mutations. Darwin didn't know about genetics, so he didn't know how natural variations were passed from one organism to another.
Dawkins is a neo-Darwinist, isn't that right?
Yes, Thomas, Dawkins clearly represents neo-Darwinism.
It seems to me that the more science understands genetics, the less plausible Darwin's grander claims become. It's still just an assertion that unguided mutations can create brand new, complex, and functional organisms. There is no direct evidence for that, am I right? I mean, mutations normally degrade genetic information. They do not increase it.
There's a lot of people who will disagree with you there, Hiromi. They will say there is tons of evidence.
Tons? Well, I haven't seen it yet, but I have heard a lot of circular reasoning about it. Anyway, I've read that in some cases, genetic degradation can actually benefit organisms in a surprising way.
Genetic what? Degradation?
Yes. The microbiologist Michael Bay writes about this phenomenon in his book Darwin Devolves. He accepts that unguided evolution can explain biological changes at the species and genus level, but he doesn't think it can explain changes at higher taxonomic levels. He argues that random mutation and natural selection strongly favor devolution, not the evolution, which is used to explain complex new structures.
Wait a minute. Devolution? What is devolution?
As I understand it, devolution is a kind of biological change by simplification. Mutations usually break genes, but this can sometimes actually help an organism survive. But breaking genes is very different from building genes, right?
Sorry, I'm not with you, Hiromi. How can breaking genes have survival value?
Let me use an illustration. Imagine a sailing ship in a storm where equipment is thrown overboard to lighten the boat and keep it afloat. Throwing things overboard has survival value, but the ship that survives a storm has less equipment than it did before, right? Behe says we can see similar things in genetics. When genetic information is degraded so that an organism does fewer things, this can provide advantages for survival. He gives several examples in his book. Wait, I have a reference here. An example, Yes, a gene called APOC3. Behe says that loss of function mutations in this gene actually makes people less prone to heart attacks, even if they eat a high-fat diet. He argues that the Darwinian mechanism is, quote, capable to an extent of eliminating or modifying pre-existing molecular systems, and in the process giving rise to new varieties of creatures below the biological classification level of family, but incapable of building functionally complex molecular structures, unquote.
What do you know? Never heard about the benefit of breaking things before.
Okay, thank you, Hiromi. I'm afraid we have to stop there, but we'll continue discussing evolution next time. Then we will also talk more about the concept of design. Douglas, I wonder if you could introduce that topic next time. Is it okay? What does Dawkins say about design, and what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I can do that.
Good, thank you. Okay, everyone, see you next time. I will turn off the recorder. You have been listening to The Question of God. Has our civilization outgrown God? A 12-episode podcast series from Biocosmos Norway and Damaris Norway. You can find references and resources online. The script by Birger Elliott Benson and Peter S. Williams was adapted from parts of the book Outgrowing God, A Beginner's Guide to Richard Dawkins, and The God Debate by Peter S. Williams, who also composed the music. All voices, including mine, were performed using AI. The sound editor was Birger Elliott Benson.